Racist cop threatens senior female army. Officer loses job immediately. Hey there, before we dive into the story, take a moment to let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Drop a comment below. We're excited to hear from you. Today's story is unlike anything you've heard before. It'll make you rethink what you thought was normal. Picture this. You're walking into a grocery store on a quiet weekend afternoon. Everything seems calm, people going about their shopping. But suddenly you witness something that you never saw coming. A man, a police officer, doing something you couldn't possibly imagine. And in that moment, you have to make a choice, turn a blind eye, or stand up for what's right. This is the story of Rachel Johnson, a former soldier, a strong woman who's faced countless challenges, both on the battlefield and in everyday life. But what will she do when faced with an abuse of power in the middle of a grocery store? How will it end? A silent yet intense showdown between two worlds with a truth that's about to be revealed beneath the fluorescent lights and the soft background music of the aisles. Do you think you are ready for the outcome? Let's jump into the story. Let me take you to a place that at first glance seems ordinary, yet in the midst of its routine, a storm is quietly brewing. Meet Rachel Johnson. She's 38, a former soldier, and now lives in a quiet suburb of New York. Rachel spent years serving her country, bravely carrying out dangerous missions in the Middle East. But today, her life is far from the battlefield. Now she leads a simpler life, working a part-time job at a local grocery store. Her apartment is modest, her routine is simple, but beneath it all, there's a strength that comes from years of military discipline. It's another regular Saturday afternoon. The store is bustling with weekend shoppers, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, and the shuffle of carts filling the air. Rachel is behind the counter doing what she's done countless times, nothing out of the ordinary. But sometimes the ordinary has a way of surprising you. Enter Cory Miller, a 45-year-old local cop. He strides through the door with an air of superiority, his presence almost demanding attention. He walks past the aisles, hardly glancing at anyone, as if the world revolves around him. His uniform, crisp and authoritative, signals more than just a job. It's a badge of power. And as fate would have it, Rachel crosses paths with him. What starts as a simple interaction quickly turns into something more. Cory, in an almost careless way, drops a can from his cart. And when Rachel kindly bends down to return it, his response is less than gracious. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a look that drips with disdain. And in that moment, Rachel feels it, the weight of the unspoken tension, the sudden shift from mundane to something far more unsettling. This isn't just a grocery store anymore. It's a clash of worlds quietly beginning to unfold. Do you ever wonder how one small moment can change the course of your day or even your life? Well, this is one of those moments. And Rachel, strong and steady as ever, is about to make a decision that could redefine her quiet existence. The tension between Rachel and Cory was palpable, like an invisible force in the air thickening with each passing moment. What seemed like a simple grocery run for Rachel was now shaping up to be something else entirely. She had done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve the cold, dismissive response that Cory had just given her. But as soon as she bent down to pick up the can he had dropped, she felt it. The flicker of superiority in his eyes, the sense that he thought he was above it all. He didn't apologize. Instead, he smirked just slightly, but enough to be noticed. And in that small, unspoken action, Cory Miller had spoken volumes. His expression, his posture, even the way he disregarded the small act of kindness Rachel had extended, all screamed of entitlement, of a man who somewhere along the line had come to believe that others, especially people like Rachel, existed to serve him. Don't worry about it, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I've got it. Rachel stood there just a few feet away, her hand still outstretched, the can gently resting on her palm. The words hung in the air, thick with disdain. She could feel it, the way his eyes lingered on her, not with recognition or gratitude, but with a judgment she couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, not exactly, but it was something more insidious, something that felt worse. There was something about the way Cory spoke, the way he carried himself, that made Rachel feel small, invisible even, as if she were somehow less than him just because of who she was or the job she was doing. The problem wasn't the can. The problem wasn't even the words he said. It was the unspoken truth they carried, that in his eyes she was nothing. She wasn't worth the courtesy of a simple thank you or even a basic level of respect. To him, she was just a nameless face in a crowd, someone who didn't matter, someone who could be dismissed. And that's when Rachel realized something. This wasn't about the can. This wasn't about an innocent accident that he had caused. This was about something much larger, something that had been building for far too long. The small, subtle moments of disrespect that people like Cory, those with power, didn't even think twice about. The way they walk through the world, oblivious to how their actions affect others. And worse, the way they assume their entitlement is a given. Rachel took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just stood there steady and let the silence stretch between them. The whole store seemed to hold its breath as she processed what had just happened. It wasn't the first time she had experienced something like this. Over the years, Rachel had faced countless instances where people had underestimated her, where they assumed that just because she was a woman or because she no longer wore a uniform, she didn't deserve to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. But today, here now, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let this moment slide. She wasn't going to walk away and pretend like nothing had happened. Because that's the thing, isn't it? It's easy to ignore the small moments, to tell yourself that a little disrespect doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But it does. Every time you let it slide, every time you say it's not a big deal, it adds up, it builds. And soon enough, the weight of all those small moments becomes something much harder to ignore. It becomes a system that tells people like Rachel that they don't matter, that they're invisible. Cory's smug expression never wavered. He didn't realize what he'd done. He didn't realize that this was more than just a small interaction between two strangers in a grocery store. It was a reflection of something much bigger, of the everyday injustices that people like Rachel, people of color, women, the invisible people faced on a daily basis. And as Rachel stood there, the full weight of that realization hit her. She wasn't just upset about his words or his attitude. She was angry at the system that allowed this to happen. The system that had been built to make her and people like her feel small, to make them feel less than. She knew what it was like to serve in a system that didn't always value you, to be overlooked, to be pushed aside. But in this moment, standing in front of Cory, she realized something else too. That despite all the times she'd been treated like this, despite all the moments where she'd been silenced or dismissed, there was power in standing up. There was strength in speaking out. And she wasn't going to let this moment pass without making that clear. "Is that how you treat everyone?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet strength. Cory paused. His smirk faltered just for a second, but then he straightened up and his chest puffing out slightly. "What's your problem?" he asked almost incredulously. "It's just a can." Rachel took a step closer. Her eyes locked on his. "It's not about the can, Cory. It's about respect." His eyes narrowed at the mention of his name. But before he could respond, Rachel added, "It's about treating people like they matter." There was a flicker of something in Cory's expression, a brief moment of hesitation. But then just as quickly, the smirk returned stronger than before. "You really think I have to answer to you?" And in that moment, something inside Rachel snapped. She wasn't going to let him belittle her any longer. She wasn't going to let him get away with treating her like she was nothing. "Not today, not anymore. You don't have to answer to me," she said, her voice firm, "but you should answer to yourself. And to anyone who's ever had to put up with this kind of disrespect. You're not the only one in this world, Cory, and the sooner you realize that, the better." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. And for the first time Rachel saw it, she saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't as confident as he had been moments before. The facade of power, of control was starting to crack. And as the seconds stretched on, Rachel knew one thing: she had made her point. Cory, clearly flustered, now glanced around. The eyes of the other shoppers were on him. Some looked away quickly, others watched quietly, but it was enough to make him pause. Enough to make him realize that his little show of power had come to an end. And just like that, the tide began to shift. What started as a small, seemingly insignificant moment in a grocery store had transformed into something much bigger. It was no longer just about a can. It was about respect, dignity, and the right to be treated like a human being. The change had begun. And for Cory Miller, it was too late to turn back now. Rachel stood there, the can still in her hand, her gaze locked on Cory. The moment stretched on thicker than any tension she'd ever felt in a battlefield. But she didn't flinch. She didn't lash out. Instead, she slowly set the can back on the shelf, her fingers grazing the cold metal for just a second longer than necessary. The subtle motion was more than just about returning the item. It was about restoring her own sense of control in a situation that was quickly spiraling. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Cory, still standing with his arms crossed, watched her with an air of disbelief, clearly expecting something more. Maybe an argument, maybe an apology from her. Anything that would let him maintain the upper hand in this little game of power. But Rachel didn't give him the satisfaction. She didn't need to. Rachel knew that this moment wasn't just about the can or the disrespect he had shown her. It was about something bigger, something far more profound. She was standing on the edge of a decision that could alter the course of her day, her life. But she had been trained for moments like these, trained to hold her ground, to maintain her discipline, and to rise above. In the military, when everything is chaos and noise, your strength doesn't come from reacting to everything around you. It comes from staying grounded, from the quiet power of self-control. And that was exactly what Rachel did. She took a deep breath, held it for a moment, and then let it out slowly. Cory was still watching her, waiting for something. But Rachel wasn't playing his game. She was playing her own. She wasn't going to let herself be rattled by his rude behavior, nor would she let herself become part of a conflict that would only feed his sense of superiority. Rachel knew from experience that sometimes the best way to handle a situation like this wasn't with words, but with silence. Silence, when used correctly, is a force unto itself. It speaks louder than any words can, and it shifts the power dynamic in a way that words often fail to do. Rachel wasn't going to lower herself to his level by arguing. She knew better than that. In this moment, her silence was more powerful than any response she could give him. It was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to let his small, dismissive actions define her. She glanced around the store briefly. The other customers, though they were preoccupied with their shopping, seemed to notice the tension. But nobody stepped in. Nobody tried to intervene. That's what silence does in moments like these. It isolates you, but it also gives you a moment to reflect, to assess the situation. Rachel realized that none of these people would come to her defense. In a way, they were all complicit in the silence that allowed people like Cory to act with such impunity, but that wasn't going to stop her. As Rachel returned to her task, carefully wiping down the counter, she thought about how often people like Cory didn't even realize the effect their actions had. It wasn't just about a dropped can or a lack of basic courtesy. It was about the larger picture, the unspoken rules that govern the way people interacted with one another based on their perceived status. And in Cory's eyes, she was just another person to look down on. But Rachel wasn't like the others he had brushed aside in his life. She had stood her ground before. She'd faced challenges much greater than a man's bad attitude and come out on the other side stronger. In this moment, this was nothing she couldn't handle. The silence between them continued to hang in the air, but Rachel could feel it shifting. She could feel the weight of it lifting just slightly, as if the tension itself was starting to question its right to exist. Her training had taught her that in times of stress, in times of confrontation, the most powerful thing you can do is maintain control. Stay calm, stay centered. Don't give away your power by letting someone else dictate how you feel. It wasn't easy, of course. Part of her wanted to snap back at him, to call him out for the condescending way he spoke to her, for the complete lack of respect he had shown. It would have been so easy to let anger take over, to let that spark of outrage ignite into something bigger. But Rachel didn't do that. Instead, she took control. She let his words wash over her, but never let them sink in. Rachel wasn't just reacting to a single moment. She was responding to a lifetime of moments like this. A lifetime of being underestimated, overlooked, and disrespected because of her gender, her race, her role. But instead of reacting with frustration or anger, she responded with something far stronger, self-discipline. And as she moved through the rest of her shift quietly and with intention, she noticed something she hadn't before. The world around her didn't feel quite as heavy. The silence between her and Cory had shifted too. Now it was his discomfort she could feel, not hers. For a man who had relied on his uniform and his badge to make him feel powerful, Cory seemed to be losing his grip on both. He still watched her from the corner of his eye, but now there was something else there. A flicker of uncertainty. A realization that Rachel in her quiet strength had turned the tables on him without saying a word. As Rachel continued to go about her work, she understood something that few people ever truly grasp. Power doesn't always come from loud actions or confrontations. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is be calm, be still, be unshaken. In a world where everyone expects you to react to prove yourself, sometimes the greatest victory is simply in choosing not to. Cory might have had his badge. He might have thought he had the power in this situation. But Rachel had something he couldn't touch. She had inner strength, and that was far more powerful than anything his badge could ever give him. The shift continued and the moment passed. But as Rachel moved through the aisles, stacking cans, checking prices, she carried with her the knowledge that she had won, not by force, not by raising her voice, but by standing her ground with grace and dignity. And as the customers came and went, none of them knew what had happened. They didn't know the quiet battle that had taken place between Rachel and Cory, but Rachel did, and that was enough. The silence between Rachel and Cory became heavier with each passing second. It was as though the air itself had thickened, laden with the unspoken tension that only grew more suffocating. Cory, standing there with his arms crossed, seemed to be waiting for Rachel to break. He probably expected her to snap, to say something, anything that would allow him to continue with his usual dismissive attitude. But Rachel remained composed. Her eyes never wavered, her posture never shifted. Cory's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. The calm demeanor Rachel had adopted seemed to grate on him. He couldn't stand it not being in control, not being able to manipulate the situation as he always did. It was as though his sense of superiority depended on making others feel small, and Rachel was refusing to play into that. For a few moments, nothing happened. The store continued to hum with the sounds of shopping carts and low chatter. But then, without warning, Cory's voice broke through the stillness, louder this time, his words sharp and full of contempt. "You think you can stand there all high and mighty, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you're special just because you were in the military? That's your big claim to fame, huh? That makes you somehow better than me." Rachel felt a wave of frustration rise in her chest, but she kept her breathing steady, her eyes locked on Cory. This wasn't the time to lose her composure, but she wasn't blind to what was happening now. His words weren't just insults, they were the kind of petty, hurtful comments that come from a place of deep insecurity. He needed to bring her down to make himself feel bigger, feel more important, and the fact that she wasn't reacting was making him angrier by the second. "You think you can tell me what to do just because you wore a uniform," he continued, his voice rising. "People like you don't get to lecture people like me. You don't get to tell me how to behave." Rachel took a breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. She wasn't surprised. She knew people like Cory, people who used their position to belittle others to make them feel inferior. It wasn't just about the uniform he wore. It was about power. It was about feeling like the world owed him something, like his badge gave him the right to treat people as if they were beneath him. And Rachel in that moment was just another person he could trample on. But what Cory failed to understand, what he couldn't see, was that Rachel wasn't just some ordinary person. She wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated, someone who would shrink under the weight of his words. She had been through far worse than this, far worse than anything he could throw at her. She had seen real danger, real disrespect, and she had learned to handle it. She had stood tall when faced with bullets flying overhead, when lives depended on her decisions. And she wasn't about to let some pompous cop, someone who hid behind his badge and uniform, talk down to her now. "You're right," Rachel said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "I don't have to tell you how to behave, but maybe you should ask yourself why you think you have the right to treat anyone this way." Cory blinked momentarily, thrown off balance. He wasn't expecting this response. He was used to people backing down, used to people cowering when faced with his authority. But Rachel wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. "You think I'm intimidated by you?" Cory sneered, taking a step closer to her, trying to loom over her. "You're nothing but a washed-up soldier who thinks she still matters." Rachel's jaw clenched, but she refused to let the insult get to her. She had heard worse in her time. She had been called worse. But this was different. Cory was trying to take something from her dignity, her sense of self-worth. And she wasn't going to let him. "You don't know anything about me," Rachel said, her eyes narrowing. "You don't know what I've been through or what I've sacrificed, and you don't get to tear me down just because you feel threatened by me." Cory stepped back, his face reddening. The power dynamic had shifted, and he could feel it. He could feel his control slipping through his fingers, and it made him uncomfortable. He had expected to walk into the store, make some snide comment, and have people fall in line. But Rachel wasn't playing that game. "You think your military service makes you better than everyone else?" Cory spat, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're just a pawn, just like the rest of them. A puppet that did what she was told." Rachel felt the sting of his words, but she didn't let it show. She had learned long ago that people like Cory were the ones who had the most to prove. They wore their arrogance like a shield, hiding behind their uniforms, their titles, their power. But all of it was empty. All of it was fragile. "You don't know the first thing about sacrifice," Rachel said quietly, her voice steady but firm. "You think you have power because you wear a badge. But power doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from how you treat people, how you treat those who can't fight back, who can't defend themselves." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge, a declaration. Cory looked at her, his face contorted with rage, but there was something else there too, something unfamiliar. Doubt, hesitation. Rachel stood tall, unflinching. She wasn't scared of him. She wasn't scared of his badge or his words, and she wasn't going to let him intimidate her any longer. She wasn't the one who needed to prove herself. Cory was. As the moments dragged on, Rachel could feel the shift. Cory wasn't the only one in the room who held power. She had it too. Not from her past, not from the uniform she once wore, but from something deeper. Something more lasting, her character, her strength, her ability to stand at her ground in the face of cruelty. And it was that strength that was making Cory squirm. It was that strength that was starting to chip away at his arrogance piece by piece. "You're wrong about me," Rachel continued, her voice a little louder now. "You don't know me, Cory, and you'll never understand what it means to stand for something bigger than yourself. That's something you'll never get from your badge." The words hit Cory like a slap in the face. For the first time in this entire interaction, he seemed to lose his composure. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, and Rachel could see it. He wasn't the powerful figure he had imagined himself to be. Not anymore. She had done it. Without raising her voice, without throwing a single punch, Rachel had made her point. She had stood up to him, and now he was the one who had to face the consequences of his own arrogance. The tension between them wasn't gone, but it had changed. It had shifted from a fight for control to a battle of will, and Rachel was winning. The store felt smaller, now the air thick with the tension between Rachel and Cory. Around them, the quiet hum of the aisles continued. Shoppers moving in and out, unaware of the confrontation taking place. Rachel stood there, unmoving, her eyes fixed firmly on Cory's. She didn't say a word. Not a single sound escaped her lips yet. In that silence, something was shifting. Cory, for the first time since their interaction began, looked uncomfortable. His posture had faltered, the confidence he had displayed earlier slipping away as he stood there, his arms crossed in front of him, but now his body language seemed less sure. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, as if trying to recalibrate himself. It was the smallest of movements, but Rachel noticed it. She didn't speak, and yet in her silence she was saying everything that needed to be said. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't retreating. She wasn't giving him the satisfaction of her response. Rachel's calm, unyielding presence was louder than any words could have been. It was the kind of strength that came not from confrontation, but from simply standing her ground. Cory shifted again, his discomfort growing. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He had expected her to react, to fall into the trap of raising her voice, of getting angry. That's what people like him were used to, people reacting to his words, his power. But Rachel wasn't like everyone else. She wasn't here to play by his rules. In that moment, Cory realized that his usual tactics weren't working. He couldn't get under Rachel's skin, couldn't provoke the reaction he was used to. His power, his badge, his presence, they were meaningless to her. She wasn't intimidated by him. She wasn't threatened by him. And that realization, that fundamental shift in the power dynamic made Cory uneasy. He tried again, his voice a little shakier now. "What are you just going to stand there and ignore me?" he sneered. "You think you've won something, huh?" Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her gaze never wavered from his eyes. She wasn't just ignoring him. She was looking through him, seeing the man who had tried to tear her down, who thought his words could break her. But he was wrong. This wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving who was stronger or who could yell the loudest. This was about something deeper, something that Cory couldn't understand. It was about power, real power, the kind that comes from self-control, the kind that comes from knowing that you don't have to raise your voice, you don't have to fight back, because your presence alone is enough to make others feel small. Cory's voice grew more erratic as he tried to regain his footing. "You're nothing," he spat. "Just a nobody who thinks she's special because she wore a uniform. You don't get to stand here and lecture me." But Rachel remained silent. Her body was still, but her energy, her aura was undeniable. The store around them seemed to fall away, and all that remained was the battle between them. It wasn't about who was right or wrong, who had the best words or the best comeback. It was about Rachel's quiet resolve, her refusal to bend to Cory's will. Cory began to fidget, his eyes darting away from hers for the first time. He was losing control. The words he had intended to use as weapons were now falling flat. He wasn't breaking her. He wasn't forcing her to submit to his power. In fact, it was the opposite. Rachel wasn't shrinking in the face of his anger. She was standing taller. Rachel had learned long ago that the greatest form of resistance isn't always the loudest. It's not the outburst, the confrontation, the fiery comeback. No, the greatest form of resistance is in the stillness, in the ability to hold your ground, to refuse to engage in the power struggle that others try to drag you into. Cory, in his desperate attempts to regain the upper hand, was only revealing his own weakness. He was relying on his badge, on his sense of superiority. But Rachel wasn't intimidated by these things. She wasn't looking for validation from others. She knew her worth. And her silence, her unwavering presence, was the most powerful statement she could make. The longer she stood there, the more Cory began to crumble. His words became less confident, his posture less assured. He tried to change the subject, to deflect, but Rachel didn't budge. She stayed still, poised, unshaken. It wasn't that she didn't care about the words he was saying. It was that she knew they didn't matter. His insults, his attempts to belittle her, they were empty. They were as weak as his need to assert dominance. As the seconds dragged on, the power in the room shifted even more. It was as if Cory's world was closing in on him. His facade of authority was slipping, and Rachel was right there, still unwavering, like a pillar that couldn't be moved. Cory began to shift his gaze, no longer able to maintain eye contact. His posture slumped ever so slightly. This was the turning point. Rachel didn't need to shout. She didn't need to argue. All she had to do was stand there and let Cory see himself in the reflection of her silence. He had been so certain of his control, of his ability to dominate and intimidate. But now in front of her, he was exposed. Rachel wasn't just refusing to engage in the fight he wanted. She was showing him that she was above it. She didn't need to get caught in his games. She didn't need to stoop to his level to prove her worth. Her silence spoke volumes. It was a language that Cory couldn't understand, one that made him feel small in a way he never had before. He was used to people being intimidated by his words. He was used to people backing down, deferring to his authority. But Rachel wasn't like anyone he had encountered before. And the longer she stood there unshaken, the more it became clear Rachel had won. Not by force, not by anger, but by the quiet power of her resolve. She had forced Cory to confront himself, to face the reality that his position, his power didn't make him untouchable. It didn't make him right. In the silence between them, Cory was finally starting to see the truth. He wasn't the one with control anymore. He was the one who had been exposed. He was the one who had been left vulnerable by his own arrogance. In Rachel, she stood tall, unflinching, her silence louder than any words could have been. She had fought the battle without ever raising a fist, without ever raising her voice. And in that stillness, she had won. Cory's mind was racing. The anger that had been simmering in him was now boiling over. He couldn't understand it. Why? Why hadn't Rachel backed down? Why hadn't she reacted the way everyone else did when faced with his presence, his authority? She should have been intimidated, should have shrunk in fear under the weight of his words and his badge. But instead she stood there, as steady and unmoving as a rock, not even blinking. The more he thought about it, the more his confusion turned to rage. It wasn't just that Rachel refused to be intimidated. No, it was something deeper, something that threatened everything he believed about power. He had always been in control, always had the upper hand. His uniform, his badge, they gave him power, gave him a sense of security that he had come to depend on. But Rachel had cracked that illusion, had forced him to confront the reality that his power meant nothing to her. The reality was that Cory was losing control, and he hated it, his face flushed with anger and his fists clenched at his sides. The calm, collected Rachel he had encountered earlier, she was nowhere to be found. She had broken through his armor, and now all that remained was a storm of emotion he couldn't contain. He didn't know what to do with himself with this feeling of vulnerability that was crawling up his spine. He had never felt small before. He had never felt this way, as if his position and power were slipping through his fingers like sand. "Don't just stand there," Cory snapped, his voice growing more harsh, more erratic. "Say something. You think you've won. You think you're better than me because you're some kind of soldier." He took a step toward her, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You think that gives you the right to judge me, to disrespect me?" Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't move a muscle. She was like a wall in front of him, impenetrable and unyielding, and that made him angrier. Cory's heart was pounding in his chest now, the adrenaline flooding through his veins. He had to break her, had to make her feel as small as he was feeling. He couldn't let her stand there and make him feel inferior. "You think I'm scared of you?" he barked, his eyes wide with rage. "You think you can just stand there and look down on me? I'm a cop, damn it!" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the depth of his fury. "I'm the one in control here. You're nothing." Rachel remained silent. She didn't even blink. And that silence, that absence of reaction, was the worst thing of all to Cory. It was like she had stripped him of his power without even saying a word. Every time she refused to react, every time she refused to acknowledge his attempts to provoke her, it made him feel smaller, weaker. His voice rose again, but this time there was a dangerous edge to it. "If you don't say something, if you don't show me some respect, you'll regret it." For the first time in their exchange, Rachel's eyes flickered. But it wasn't fear that he saw there. It was something much more unsettling, something that sent a chill down his spine. It was calm, a quiet, steady determination that made him realize just how much he was losing. He wasn't in control anymore. The situation was slipping away from him, and he couldn't get a hold of it. His anger was boiling over now, and he couldn't stop it. He reached out his hand, shaking with the force of his frustration. He had never felt like this before, completely out of control, completely powerless. The force of his anger surged, and without thinking, he grabbed her by the arm. Rachel's muscles tensed at the contact, but she didn't react otherwise. She didn't struggle, didn't try to pull away. Her eyes were still locked on his steady, unblinking, unflinching. Cory could feel his heart racing as he realized what he had just done. He had crossed a line, but it didn't matter. He was desperate now. Desperate to maintain some shred of control. "You're gonna listen to me," Cory spat, his grip tightening. "You don't get to disrespect me. Not like this." And yet in his anger, Cory failed to see that his actions weren't just a display of power. They were a display of weakness. His anger wasn't the mark of strength, it was the mark of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of having his authority questioned. Fear that his badge didn't give him the power he thought it did. Rachel's face remained unchanged, but inside a storm was brewing, not of anger but of clarity. She could feel the heat of Cory's grip on her arm, but she wasn't afraid. This wasn't about physical strength. It wasn't about who could overpower who. This was about something much deeper. It was about respect. It was about dignity. And Rachel knew that no matter how much Cory tried to push, tried to intimidate, tried to assert his power, he had already lost. The irony was clear to her now. Cory thought he was using his power to control her, But in reality, it was his own fear, his own insecurity that was controlling him. He was afraid of being exposed and afraid of being seen for what he really was, just a man in a uniform. Just a man who thought his badge gave him something more than he deserved. And in that moment, Rachel saw him for what he truly was, a man afraid of losing the one thing he had relied on for so long, his power. And that fear, that vulnerability, was far more telling than anything else he had said or done. Rachel took a slow, deliberate breath. She didn't fight back. She didn't scream. She didn't pull away. She simply stood there, her eyes meeting his unwavering. The more she stood there, the more she could see Cory unraveling. The tightness in his grip loosened. His anger was fading, replaced by something else, a deep, gnawing realization. And as the seconds passed, Cory's grip finally loosened. He stepped back, his face pale, his hands trembling. For the first time, he was silent, and Rachel, without a word, simply watched as he turned away. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He had lost. Not because of anything she had done, but because of his own inability to control his emotions, his own failure to understand that true power comes not from domination, but from restraint. As Cory walked away defeated and broken, Rachel stood tall, the quiet strength within her unwavering. She hadn't needed to raise a fist, hadn't needed to scream. She had won simply by standing her ground, refusing to be dragged into a battle of egos. And in doing so, she had exposed the truth. The greatest power comes from knowing who you are and knowing that nothing can make you feel small unless you let it. As the seconds stretched on, the tension in the air seemed to shift like a heavy fog slowly beginning to lift. Cory's attempt to assert his dominance had faltered, his power crumbling in front of Rachel's unwavering presence. But now something else was happening. It wasn't just between them anymore. The energy of the moment had spread beyond the two of them, reaching out to the people around them. At first, the other shoppers had continued on with their tasks, oblivious to the growing storm. But slowly their attention began to turn. It wasn't an obvious thing at first, a glance here, a shift in posture there. But soon enough, the subtle shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Cory's anger, his authority, his attempts to control the situation, they weren't just being ignored by Rachel anymore. They were being noticed by the people in the store. Rachel's silence, her refusal to engage, had caused an unnoticed ripple. It was like an invisible thread being pulled through the crowd. Slowly, the people around her started to feel it. They started to see it. The way Cory had tried to belittle Rachel, the way he had used his power to intimidate. They saw it for what it was, an attempt to exert control over someone weaker, someone who was different. It wasn't loud. There were no shouts or angry words from the crowd. Instead, there was something more subtle, more powerful. It was in the way people's gazes shifted, in the way their bodies subtly tilted toward the confrontation. People were watching, but not just watching out of curiosity. They were becoming aware of what was happening. A few people began to glance at each other, exchanging looks that spoke volumes. No words were necessary. The tension had become something more than just a clash between Cory and Rachel. It was now a situation that everyone was starting to realize held significance. And then, as if some silent cue had been given, a few people reached into their pockets or bags. Our phones came out, the screens lighting up as they began to record. It was small at first, just one or two, then three or four. But as more people raised their phones, the significance of the moment became undeniable. What had been a personal confrontation was now becoming something much larger. The people around them weren't just passive witnesses anymore. They were participants in a moment that could no longer be ignored. They were recording the truth. They were capturing the reality of what was happening right in front of them. Rachel noticed this shift. It wasn't just Cory who was feeling the pressure now. The weight of the crowd's gaze had started to land on him too. Cory could feel their eyes on him, the judgment seeping into every glance. The invisible force he had been wielding as power. His badge, his arrogance was starting to crack under the weight of the collective awareness around him. Rachel had become the center of attention. Yes, but so had Cory, and in a way, it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about what this moment represented. It was about the larger implications of power and respect, about standing up against injustice, about refusing to let one person's arrogance slide unnoticed. The crowd wasn't just watching. They were waking up. They were starting to understand the truth. And as more phones came out, more people started to realize that what was happening here was something that needed to be seen, needed to be shared. It was no longer just a personal exchange, it was a statement. Cory felt the change too. He could see it in the way people were looking at him, their eyes now filled with something more than curiosity. There was a kind of collective understanding, a shared recognition of what was happening. This wasn't just about a cop trying to control a woman in a grocery store anymore. This was about power, about the abuse of power, about how people with authority sometimes think they can do whatever they want. And now the crowd was speaking up not with words, but with their presence. They were no longer silent observers. They had become active participants in documenting the moment, in bearing witness to the truth. Some of them had probably seen this kind of thing happen before, people in positions of power using that power to put others down. But now it wasn't just a story that would be shared later. It was a truth being recorded, being made undeniable. Rachel could see that things were changing, that the balance of power was shifting. Cory, who had thought that he was in control, that his badge gave him the right to dictate the terms, was now beginning to feel the weight of the crowd's gaze. It was no longer just about him and Rachel. The collective power of the crowd's awareness was becoming something Cory couldn't ignore. He could feel his frustration building again, but this time it wasn't just anger at Rachel. It was a deeper sense of vulnerability, a realization that he was losing control, not just of the situation, but of the perception around it. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was a man exposed for what he was, someone who had relied on the system to protect him, someone who thought his badge would shield him from the consequences of his actions. As the phones continued to record, Rachel stood tall. She knew what was happening. She knew that this was no longer just a personal fight. It was something bigger. The crowd wasn't just witnessing injustice. They were actively participating in holding it accountable. This wasn't just about her standing up to Cory. This was about the collective voice of everyone in that store, about the truth that couldn't be ignored anymore. And Rachel, she wasn't just a passive participant either. She was the catalyst. She had set this moment into motion, not with anger or confrontation, but with quiet strength. Her refusal to engage, her willingness to stand firm in the face of adversity, had forced others to see what was really happening. And now the crowd had become part of the story. The energy in the store had shifted completely. Cory was no longer the dominant figure he had once been. His power had been diluted by the collective awareness of those around him. Rachel wasn't the only one standing up to him now. The crowd was standing with her silently through their actions. And that, perhaps more than anything, was what made Cory's position so untenable. The moment had gone beyond just a personal confrontation. It had become a public reckoning, a statement of collective power, of community, awareness, of the refusal to stand by and let injustice go unnoticed. And in that moment, Cory was no longer just an officer. He was a man exposed, out of control, and completely vulnerable. Rachel didn't need to say a word. The crowd had already spoken for her. The moment had been building, the tension in the store so thick, you could almost feel it in the air. Cory had pushed, and Rachel had stood firm, her silence a shield that had cracked through his arrogance. But now the time for silence was over. The crowd had seen enough. The cameras were rolling, and Cory's power was unraveling piece by piece. Rachel could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about the two of them standing in the middle of a grocery store locked in a silent battle of wills. No, this had grown into something much larger, something much more significant. As Cory took another step toward her, his face twisted with frustration, his words spat out like venom. Something in Rachel shifted. The calm that had kept her steady for so long now transformed into a quiet fire that burned in her chest. It wasn't anger, not really. It was clarity. A clear, undeniable sense of what needed to be done. She wasn't going to let this man or anyone like him continue to act with such disregard for human dignity. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without speaking the truth. Cory's threats had gone on long enough. Rachel took a step forward, her body moving with purpose, and as she looked Cory in the eyes, she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. "You have no right to speak to me like that," she said, her words cutting through the tension. "You think you can intimidate me with your words and your badge, but I'm done being silent." Cory stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words, but none came. Rachel could feel the shift in the room. The crowd that had been watching quietly now leaned in. Their phones, still recording, captured every word, every moment. This wasn't just a private confrontation anymore. This was something bigger. This was a moment of truth. Rachel took a deep breath. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "You can try to bully me," she continued, "but I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not afraid of the system that lets you think you're above everyone else. What you did today was wrong, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Her voice was steady, her eyes unwavering. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her presence, her words carried all the weight of the truth. Cory's arrogance had failed him. The power he thought he wielded was nothing more than a mask, and it was starting to slip. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The crowd was still, as if collectively holding its breath, waiting for Cory to react, waiting for him to say something, anything. But nothing came. Cory's face was red, his jaw clenched. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him now. The realization that he was no longer in control, the facade of authority he had built up for years, reinforced by his uniform, was falling apart. He was exposed, vulnerable, and Rachel, with just a few quiet words, had shattered the illusion he had been hiding behind. It wasn't the words, though. It was the act of speaking them. In that moment, Rachel had become more than just a woman standing up for herself. She had become a symbol of resistance, of strength in the face of oppression, a symbol of what happens when one person refuses to stay silent, refuses to let fear control them. And that was the lesson. Sometimes speaking up doesn't change everything immediately. Sometimes the change you seek doesn't come in the form of instant results. But Rachel knew deep down that her words had planted a seed. That seed would grow not only in her own life, but in the lives of those who witnessed what happened. The people in that store, the ones who had pulled out their phones, the ones who had quietly observed what Rachel had done, would stay with them. It would make them question the systems they had accepted without challenge, the structures that allowed people like Cory to think they were invincible. Rachel couldn't change the world in an instant. She knew that, but she had set something in motion. She had spoken truth to power, and in doing so, she had become part of something much bigger than just this moment. The crowd began to murmur, some voices, louder now, others whispering to one another. It wasn't just Cory who had been affected. Rachel had sparked something in the people around her, a desire to see justice, to see accountability. She had lit a fire of awareness that could no longer be extinguished. The world around them was changing, and Rachel was a part of that change. Cory, his face pale, finally turned away. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He had no more words, no more fight left in him. The power he thought he held had evaporated, and Rachel, standing tall, felt the weight of that victory. Not because she had humiliated Cory, but because she had made him face the truth. She had made him see that his actions had consequences. The crowd, as if on cue, began to disperse, the tension gradually lifting as they returned to their own lives. But Rachel knew that things would never be the same. Not for her, not for Cory, and not for anyone who had witnessed the exchange. Rachel walked out of that store not just as a customer, not just as a woman who had stood up for herself. She walked out as a symbol of resistance, of resilience, of the quiet power that comes from speaking your truth. She wasn't a hero, she didn't need to be. But in that moment, Rachel had become something more. She had become the embodiment of what it means to stand tall in the face of injustice, and the change she sparked would echo far beyond the walls of that grocery store. The weight of silence hung heavy in the air. Cory stood there staring at Rachel, but now his eyes were no longer filled with the same arrogance they had held when this began. Instead, there was uncertainty in them, and perhaps even a flicker of fear. The crowd, once just passive onlookers, had become something else entirely. They weren't merely watching anymore. They had shifted. They were enacted, and Cory could feel it. At first, he tried to ignore it. The murmurs, the subtle shifts of body language, the glances that no longer shielded him from the gaze of the crowd. He could feel their eyes on him pressing in from all sides. Each passing second made him more aware of how isolated he had become. The realization hit him hard. No one was on his side anymore. The power he thought he had was slipping away piece by piece. It started with a few whispers, soft at first, barely perceptible against the hum of the store. But those whispers grew louder. People began to speak up, some in low voices, some with quiet but unmistakable conviction. "That's wrong," one man said loud enough for others to hear. "He shouldn't be treating her like that." The words hung in the air like a spark in dry grass. A small fire that once ignited couldn't be put out. Others began to add their voices to his agreeing, nodding, their expressions now no longer passive, no longer just bystanders. "She's right," a woman chimed in. "He had no business speaking to her like that." Cory's chest tightened. He could feel the heat rise in his face as he looked around. People were starting to speak out. People who had once been just background figures in this scenario. But now they were participants. They were choosing a side. "Someone should do something," another voice said, a little bolder, now directed at the manager of the store. "This isn't okay." The words were an invitation for action, not just an observation. Rachel had been steady, unwavering through it all, but now she stood just slightly taller, as if the weight of the crowd's support was lifting her. Cory's actions had not only brought about her own strength, but it had also brought a collective awareness that echoed through the store. She wasn't standing alone anymore. The people who had quietly observed had transformed into active participants in this moment. The manager, who had been absent through most of the confrontation, now appeared. He walked toward them slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd, clearly aware of the shift in the atmosphere. As he neared Cory, he paused, his gaze locking on the officer. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked, his voice firm, unyielding. There was no mistaking the tone. It was a question, yes, but it was also a statement. He wasn't just asking. He was addressing the situation that had become all too clear to everyone watching. Cory, still seething, looked from the manager to Rachel, his eyes darting around the store at the people who were now paying attention. He could no longer rely on his badge, on his position. The air was thick with judgment, and it was suffocating him. "No," Cory muttered, his voice low, almost defeated. "No problem." The manager didn't move, didn't back down. He stood his ground, facing Cory with quiet authority. "Then I suggest you leave," he said, his words cold and firm. "We don't tolerate that kind of behavior in this store." Cory's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Rachel saw the full extent of his unraveling. The arrogance that had once been a shield, the confidence that had made him feel invincible, was gone. In its place was a man who now felt exposed, vulnerable. He wasn't in control anymore. Not of the situation, not of the people around him. The crowd, still holding their phones, began to murmur in agreement, some of them nodding, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief at the way Cory had handled the situation. Rachel stood there, her heart beating strong and steady, her eyes unwavering. She knew that she hadn't just stood up for herself. She had stood up for something much bigger. She had become a catalyst for something larger than her confrontation with Cory. She had sparked a shift in the people around her, and now they were responding. The power of their collective voice, their collective action, was undeniable. Cory stood still for a long moment, his hands still on his belt, his eyes darting around the store, looking for something, someone to help him. But there was no one. There was no one left to back him up, no one left to validate his actions. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he turned away. "I'm done," he muttered, his words barely audible as he walked toward the door. The crowd didn't part for him. They didn't give him any space. He had to push through them, and every step he took was met with silent defiance. He wasn't walking out with his head held high. He was leaving, and the people who had witnessed this moment had made sure that he knew it. As the door closed behind him, the air in the store seemed to lighten. The tension that had been suffocating, the unease that had settled in everyone's bones, began to dissipate. But it wasn't over, not yet. The manager, who had stood by quietly, now turned to Rachel. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now, more personal. Rachel nodded, her eyes still on the door that Cory had just walked through. She wasn't focused on him anymore. She was focused on the change that had just happened. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of something deeper. She wasn't just thanking him. She was thanking the people around her, the ones who had stood up, the ones who had let their voices be heard. It was then that Rachel realized the true power of what had just happened. Cory had been the one with the badge, the one who had thought his position made him untouchable. But in the end, it wasn't his badge that had defined him. It was the actions of the people around him that had changed the course of this moment. It was their decision to speak up, to stand with her, that had made all the difference. In that small grocery store on that seemingly ordinary day, something extraordinary had occurred. The power of collective action, the power of standing together had shifted the scales of justice. And Rachel had been at the center of it all. The door to the grocery store closed behind Cory, but it wasn't just a door closing. It was a shift in something bigger. A small moment that rippled out quietly, altering the fabric of a community. The confrontation that had seemed so personal in the beginning, so confined to the space between Rachel and Cory, had transformed into something larger. No one had expected this outcome. No one had expected a moment of silence, of truth, of collective realization. But now it was clear. The tension that had filled the store was now replaced with something else, a quiet understanding. An unspoken recognition that this wasn't just about one person standing up. It was about what happens when the voices around them begin to rise, when they realize they are not alone. People left the store that day with something they hadn't come in with, something that had shifted deep within them, though they might not have known how to name it yet. They had witnessed something important, something that in the chaos of daily life they would not forget. The image of Rachel standing strong, silent, powerful, wasn't just an image. It was a symbol of the change that begins with a single act of defiance, a single refusal to stay silent. And the truth was, change doesn't always come in big, bold gestures. Sometimes it's the smallest of actions, the smallest moments where change begins. The things people choose to stand for, even in the face of uncertainty, even in the quiet. The change had started that day in the grocery store, but it wouldn't end there. It had been set in motion like a spark, lighting the way for others to follow. The community began to shift bit by bit, the silent power of individuals coming together to create something stronger than any one voice could achieve alone. The fight for justice didn't end that day, but it was no longer a solitary struggle. It was a collective one. But as we close this chapter, remember this story doesn't end with Rachel or Cory. This could be happening anywhere at any time. You may be the next person who sees injustice happening, or the next person who refuses to stay silent. So as you walk through your life, think about your role in the quiet revolution that's happening all around us. Because you never know, your small act of courage might just be the one that sparks the next big change. Are you ready to make your stand? Or will you stay silent like the rest of them? Think about it. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that might just change the way you see the world. You never know when the next moment of truth will happen. Don't miss it.